This is lecture 8.2, the second in this unit, problems faced by the disabled community. So this is a pretty straightforward agenda. It's about as long as the others, but I basically lumped things into problems and solutions. So the vast majority of the problems faced by people with disabilities are rooted in ableism, which, you've made it this far in the course. You can probably guess vaguely what we're talking about in terms of ableism, but I'll draw it out. Ableism is a prejudice against people with disabilities, particularly in underestimating people what people with disabilities can do, right? It can also be seen as a lack of concern for people with disabilities, linked to ignorance of both needs and capabilities of those with disabilities. So, for example, it would be something like a common version of ableism is talking very loud or clearly as if someone in a wheelchair has a hard time hearing you or understanding you. Just because someone's legs doesn't work doesn't mean their ears don't work or that they can't think clearly. Additionally, many issues tied with ableism are closely tied with issues in our culture. So, and we'll talk about this in this lecture. So issues with pace, issues associated with ADHD, and other issues that are actually more culturally centered and what our cultural expectations are, and that those cultural expectations are simply different than what the person with a given disability can maybe do. So, starting with ADHD. ADHD stands for attention deficit hyper disorder, something like that, or ADD, attention deficit disorder. It can go as either of those. Those are generally seen as two different things, but they're sometimes lumped together. Anyway, we once called these people hyperactive, right? Especially when they were children, or when many of us were children. It's an interesting thing because there absolutely is a medical thing to it, right? And it is treatable. There are medical conditions that are absolutely both ADD and ADHD. However, there does seem to be a component of social construction to it. We can ask ourselves, are we expecting people to concentrate too much, right? How much can you expect how long can you expect a child to actually concentrate on simple algebra, right? Is that too much for an 8-year-old to be able to do? Are we expecting adults who have adult ADD, for example? Is it unrealistic to expect human beings, grown human beings, to sit through a 2.5-hour conference? Right? Is that maybe not necessarily based in reality of what the human brain can do? Additionally, in terms of social construction, do people start to behave differently once they are diagnosed with ADD? Does a child who's diagnosed with ADD start to exhibit those symptoms we expect from them once we put that diagnosis on them? Or to put it another way, do parents start to hyper observe the child and look for those things once we start to see them as having ADD? It can go both ways, right? That idea is closely tied to the labeling theory of deviance, for example. You could just as easily say, understand how the label of criminal changes a person's behavior as the label of hyperactive may change a child's behavior. So another issue, only 25.5% of special education students graduate with a standard diploma. Only about a quarter of students in special education programs, I'll just say it again, get a diploma. This is commonly based on the student's ability to actually be able to do it, right? So we blame the student for not being able to pass the classes that aren't really organized for people like them. And many of these failures can likely be tied to flaws in the special education system itself, not actually the failing of the individual with special education program. And that's deeply troubling, right? If it was something more like only 80% of special education students graduate with a standard diploma, you may be able to link that to the disability itself and unfortunate circumstances. But the fact that it's only 25.5 really says, this is a statistic working in reality, it really says that there is a flaw with the system itself. Another issue faced by people with disabilities is the recent classification of Asperger's disorder to be part of autism spectrum disorder. This is kind of a high operating social problem, right? So the American Psychological Association reclassified in the DSM that autism spectrum disorder, it all falls along this range of behavior, right? And effectively what they said is there is no such thing as Asperger's. Asperger's is just part of level 1 autism. Well, and that may make sense to the purely clinical part of psychology. This is greatly stressful and distressing to people with Asperger's, right? Because a lot of people with Asperger's are very interested in classifying things and found a lot of identity in being someone with Asperger's disorder. They built their community around having Asperger's disorder. They did not build their community around being part of people with autism, right? So there's so much self-identity built into that. And there's actually a lot of good that can come out of knowing what a disorder that you fall into is, right? So that is kind of some social fallout that comes from this kind of greater social science theory that as social scientists we need to be aware of those sorts of problems. Many disabled people cannot advocate for themselves. This creates a major barrier in trying to make things better for people with disabilities. This is either due to severe mental disability or severe physical disability. So it may be that the person is not capable of observing the world as it is with that mental disability. It might be that a person isn't capable of leaving their bed. They might be able to talk, they might be able to think fully, but they aren't actually able to get out to a protest, right? Well, then thus they cannot actually fully advocate for themselves because they physically can't get out, right? So when only allies are advocating for a group, this sometimes creates tone-deaf miscommunications. So when it's a semi-outsider, even if they deeply care, this can create weirdness, right? It can create solutions that aren't quite solutions and actually create new problems via miscommunication. You can look back at and some other parts of life. Pace can also be an issue for disabled people. This problem is heavily rooted in American culture, which American culture is very fast-paced. And this applies to both physical and mental disabilities. This can cause able-bodied people to become frustrated with disabled people by having to wait because we are living in a fast-paced society. This can also cause disabled people to become frustrated with able-bodied people because the able-bodied people are doing things far too quickly for the disabled person to keep up with. I experienced this firsthand once when a friend of mine who has, she walks okay, but she has some problems walking sometimes, and I walk at a very quick pace, and I have very long legs. So when she was visiting me, I kept like outpacing her, right? Well, I wasn't aware of that as being a problem, but now that I'm older and a little bit wiser, I recognize that I was being kind of ableist at her because I was getting frustrated with her not coming as quickly as I needed to. Really what I needed to do was chill out a little bit, is what I really needed to do. So, ableism, disability, these are also tied with intersectionality, just like other things are. Abused and discriminated against populations have dramatically higher rates of disability. So if you are in a group that is systematically discriminated against, either a racial group, an ethnic group, a gender identity group, your chance of physical disability goes up. So often our really bad parts of town are areas that are called ghettos, are in close proximity to pollution, right? So they may be dirtier, they may be closer to power plants, they may be closer to other industrial facilities. Inadequate health care. So maybe the good hospital is across town. Maybe there's a lack of early interventions to keep you from not developing diabetes, not developing a sore on your leg, and then not ultimately, because of that sore, losing function of that leg, right? That's how lack of early intervention can hurt you. Dangerous environments. If you live in a part of town that's really crime-ridden, your chance of getting shot in the back with a bullet and being paralyzed are dramatically better, aren't they? That's a really terrible thing to think about. Lack of good prenatal care. Microencephaly, that we talked about earlier in these lectures. That is a condition that with proper prenatal care, the chances of that happening go down dramatically. That is something that can happen when there's lack of good prenatal care. Mental disability, though. Overrepresentation of students of color in special education. Most of that can be blamed on the fact that with early intervention, many mental disabilities can actually be caught and accommodated and sometimes remedied. Lack of early intervention, lack of good prenatal care, those are also tied in with mental disabilities. And these issues are often disgustingly overlooked by racism. People will see that children of color are put into special education at a higher rate, and they'll think, well, people in that group, people of that race, people like that, they're just not as intelligent. That's why they're in special education. Or, well, you know, they're not as strong, or they're weak-minded. That's why they need these things. No, it's because the structure of society did this to that group of people. Racism is just a wicked thing. Poverty is also disabling. So this is the intersection between disability and class, and poverty is a vicious cycle. Poverty can lead to disabling conditions, and then those disabilities can create people to be unable to work, right? So if you grow up poor, and if you have bad health care, and then that makes you unable to walk, just to use a very clunky example, right? That makes you unable to walk, and then you become disabled, and then because you're disabled, you can't get a job in construction that's the only good job paying around you. So then you don't get good health care for your condition. It gets worse and worse and worse, right? Politics can also use government assistance programs that the poor disabled people are dependent on to be highly regulated. No, let me reread that, sorry. Politics can cause government assistance programs to become highly regulated, right? So sometimes there are political pushes to regulate welfare systems or regulate entitlement programs, right? Well, even for people that are highly deserving, even if they absolutely qualify, this can create great bureaucratic delays for people that have a hard time buying groceries or heating their homes or things like that. And these delays can be very, very harmful to people with disabilities who are incapable of waiting in line for hours because of their physical or mental condition, right? This is my note specifically, that's what structural inequality looks like, right? The system is either built to harm a person, almost always unintentionally, or the system in the long run is just not capable of caring for the person. That's what that looks like in a big and ugly way. Now it's pretty dark. Let's look at some solutions though, because as opposed to many of the problems in this course, many of the solutions faced by people with disabilities are fairly straightforward to fix. And I put in parentheses, except prejudice, that one's really tough to fix. People will still stay ableist. But there are some physical things we can do for many people with disabilities. This idea of universal design. So this can be broken into two general categories, universal architectural design and universal instructional design. So ramps, braille signage, wider hallways and doorways, lower and adjustable desks and fixtures, things that make it so that people with physical disabilities, usually it's architectural design is oriented toward physical disability, make the space more usable for people with those sorts of issues. And those are very useful things. And then also universal instructional design. So in my courses, I try, it's not always possible, I try to only use films where it's possible to turn on closed captioning. You could also make sure that it's able to turn volume up on. Instructional design. Instructional design is really big with online classes, but it is still limited, but it's growing. It'll be a lot better in the next 10 to 15 years or so. Using e-readers instead of traditional textbook is another way that instructional design can benefit. So often e-readers enable you to be able to listen to a book on tape, something like that, or be able to adjust the size of the font of the wording. That can help a lot of people, particularly with vision issues, things like that. Independent living is another area of solution for people with physical and mental disorders. So the independent living movement encourages people with physical and mental disabilities to live on their own. This eases the life and dependence on caregivers. It can be very hard to care with a loved one with a disability, and even if the person loves them very dearly, it can be very taxing on that person. It allows residents to make their own choices, and with choices sometimes come mistakes, but they're able to learn and they're able to grow in a safe environment. And a lot of that is because healthcare staff and equipment are available, so that if an emergency should happen, then the person with the disability is capable of calling for help, but they are not supervised, so they can still have a greater sense of well-being and a greater sense of independence, and not feel like they are being lorded over all the time. The independent living movement is a really positive move, not only for people who have had disabilities their whole lives, but also older people who want to maintain some control over their lives. So there are measures that would ease a lot of ableism in education, and these are really interesting measures to think about, especially for me as an educator. It is important to note that many of these are not compatible with many standardized testing models of education. Thus, as was put into place, the No Child Left Behind Act in the early 2000s is in direct contradiction to a lot of these measures. So to really make this happen, we would have to probably push for some interesting legislation. But these are things that we could do to try to help people in education. We could include disability as part of a school's overall diversity efforts, and this is very doable in our education system as it is. So if there's a program for LGBTQ students, if there's an African American student association, a foreign student association, then you should also have a disabled students association and have programming for students with disabilities. That is something a lot of schools do, and it doesn't require so much additional effort. It just requires an additional add-on. Encourage students to develop skills that are most effective for them. So for example, if a deaf student is not capable of reading lips, that's sometimes something that's overly pushed in educating deaf students, but the person is very good at sign language, maybe instead of forcing the person to learn to read lips, we have them develop their sign language skills more fully so that they can better represent themselves through language. That might be something we could build toward. And with this and many others, it depends on what's best for the individual, not what's out of kind of a cookie cutter cutout of what we say is best for all deaf people. Maybe this deaf person is a little bit different. We could move away from placement and toward results. What does that mean? Well, a lot of the education system is based on getting high test scores, based on getting into college, based on getting a certain type of employment. Well, that might not work. A college might not be a goal for a student who has a serious learning disability or a serious mental disability, right? But independent living might be a goal for that student. So for maybe a high school student in that situation, a cooking class might make much more sense than an algebra class would, because that person will never actually use algebra in their life, but hopefully they would use some basic cooking. That is something that we could do. And this is an interesting concept, is to promote high standards, not high stakes. And I'm sure this actually could be applied to people, not just people with disabilities, but this is what it would look like. And this is the thing that would actually go counter to many of the structures embedded in our education system, but let's just think about it, right? So an example of high standards, not high stakes, would be to not threaten students with not graduating high school, but to set a goal of graduating high school, right? So it's about a mindset of the individual. It's like, okay, let's see if we can get you to graduate high school and be real proud of you. But if they aren't capable of doing that, not making such a terrible deal out of it. Another way to do it would be to set non-terminal goals, right? So that person who we want to set them for independent living, well, we can set a series of goals, and then once we achieve each of those goals, celebrate that goal, but then also have another goal set up toward a really ambitious goal, right? But have it all be useful. So have that person learn basic kitchen cleanliness, that person with a mental disability, and then teach them basic cooking skills, right? And then maybe some more advanced cooking skills, and then build toward maybe what would be necessary to get a job as a cook in a restaurant, right? And that's very useful, because then that person could get some employment. And then if they're capable of doing that before the time comes to apply for schools, maybe have them apply for culinary school and then work on getting them through culinary school. That's high standards, but not high stakes, right? It's just requires, and if they stop at any point along those non-terminal goals, they've still learned something and they've still done something good, right? It's not the end of the world. It's a kind of mindset, really, is what a lot of issues with ableism and disability rights are. Okay, that's it for this lecture. I really enjoyed having you all on this journey with me, and I will continue to talk to you as long as we keep going.